In Helsinki, by the end of the first week, many members of the government and several quite senior soldiers were close to despair. A younger, less experienced commander might well have succumbed to panic. But this was Mannerheim's fifth war, and he reviewed the growing crisis with icy calm. He'd been surprised by the sheer extent of the Soviet thrusts, but he knew that so many over such long distances would stretch Soviet logistics. Although Finnish forces everywhere had been driven back, a Soviet breakthrough had not been achieved. Mannerheim took prompt action. The commanding officer of 4th Corps, who'd been unable to prevent a near disaster north of Lake Ladoga, he replaced with Major General Woldemar Haglund, a veteran of the 27th Jaegers. He also redeployed his scarce resources, sending reinforcements to 4th Corps north of Lake Ladoga and to Suomussalmi. But he kept most of his reserves concentrated on the Karelian Isthmus. Finland could afford to give ground anywhere but there. On the Karelian front, Meretskov knew that the Finns would concentrate their forces on the central west of the Mannerheim line at Sumer, where a developed road and rail system ran northwest to Viipuri and then on to Helsinki. So he decided to attack first on the Finns' eastern flank, near the village of Taipale, where the Mannerheim line met Lake Ladoga. Enough pressure here, Meretskov reasoned, would persuade the Finns to commit their reserves, at which point the Soviets would strike at Sumer. The first Russian probes crossed the Taipale River on the 6th of December and found the far bank apparently undefended. More battalions rushed forward to exploit what seemed to be a gap in the Mannerheim line. However, all was not as it seemed. The hapless Russians advanced into a carefully prepared killing ground, covered by Finnish artillery and machine guns. The first waves of Russians were cut down in a torrent of fire. To the amazement of the Finns, the Russians kept pouring units into what was clearly a trap. They failed to understand Meretskov's strategy, which was to accept high casualties in order to engage the Finns in an attritional battle and draw their strength away from Sumer. Before dawn on the 14th of December, massed Soviet artillery opened up its first major bombardment of the war. At 11:30, the barrage lifted. Soviet tanks, accompanied by infantry in closely packed groups, moved forward. The Finns waited until the Russians reached pre-plotted firing lines and then opened up. Shrapnel tore through the dense masses of Soviet infantry, while tank after tank was hit. It took just 5 minutes to bring the Soviet attack to a halt and then send it staggering into retreat. Meretskov fed another 2 divisions into the battle and reinforced the artillery to 84 batteries. Although he had hoped for a breakthrough, he believed that the fighting was now of such intensity that it must have absorbed the Finnish reserve. That being so, it was time to alter the axis of attack. At 0500 on the 17th of December, Meretskov launched his main offensive against the Mannerheim line at Sumer. Massed Soviet artillery opened up, and for 5 hours worked its way backwards and forwards across the Finnish positions. It was the heaviest artillery bombardment experienced anywhere in the world since those on the Western Front at the beginning of November 1918. Moving along corridors left untouched by the artillery, Soviet sappers swarmed forward, attempting to lift mines and clear obstacles. Behind them rumbled the tanks, accompanied at first by clumps of Russian infantry. But infantry and armour cooperation was poor. As the tanks pushed forward, the infantry were left behind, leaving gaps. Spotting their chance to exploit this weakness, Finnish machine gunners and mortar teams opened up on the infantry. The tanks rolled on alone to the line of granite anti-tank obstacles, their tracks biting into the rock monoliths and pushing the tanks skyward at a steep angle. At this point, the Finnish anti-tank teams struck. In some places, the crew of a Bofors 37mm anti-tank gun managed to get their solid 2-pound shells directly into the vulnerable bellies of the tanks, smashing the transmission or killing some of the crew. At many points in the Suma sector, the Mannerheim line was flanked by lakes, which were now frozen solid. As his frontal assaults against the line ground to a halt, Meretskov sent columns directly across the lakes, in the hope of outflanking the main defences. But the shores of the lakes were made up of jumbles of granite boulders, cliffs and dense forests. There were only a handful of exits from most lakes, which channeled the Russian advance. With carefully placed anti-tank guns and ambush parties, these exits were turned into killing grounds. By the 19th of December, Meretskov was becoming desperate. He had promised Stalin victory for his birthday on the 21st of December. While closely packed battalions were marched over minefields, clearing them with their own bodies, the KV tank was sent into action for the first time. A squadron of these 47-ton monsters managed to smash its way through part of the Mannerheim line and into the streets of the village of Suma. But the threatened breakthrough was quickly sealed off. Finnish infantry swarmed over the roofs of the houses, jumped onto the tops of the tanks and fired their Sumis through the driver's vision slit, while others drenched the KVs with Molotov cocktails. On the 20th of December, Meretskov's armoured commanders reported that the assault on the Mannerheim line had cost 250 armoured vehicles, most of which had been lost in the fighting around Suma. Casualties, too, had been horrific. As General Osterman surveyed the battlefield through his binoculars, the sight of dozens of burnt-out Soviet tanks and dark piles of dead Russian infantry convinced him that the time had come for a counterattack. Mannerheim was much more cautious, but he too seems to have been carried away by a new infectious spirit of optimism. At 06:30 on the 23rd of December, Finnish artillery opened up for a 10-minute barrage, behind which 3 Finnish divisions, the 1st, 4th and 6th, advanced towards the Russians. They overran Russian outposts with relative ease, but as they advanced, Russian resistance increased. Faced with an increasingly resolute Soviet defense, the Finnish divisions began to collapse into a huge, ungainly mob, unresponsive to the commands of the officers. Realizing that he had a first-class debacle on his hands, Mannerheim called off the attack. The Finns lost 1,500 men on the 23rd of December, a salutary reminder of the cost of such operations. Elsewhere, however, lightly equipped semi-trained Finnish forces were beginning to strike back at Soviet columns. In the forest vastness north of Lake Ladoga, battalions of white-clad ski troops could move rapidly around the flanks of Soviet columns, striking them from unexpected directions. From these guerrilla pinpricks, a series of increasingly impressive counterattacks began to emerge. They began immediately north of Ladoga, in the area of Tolvajärvi and Ilomantsi. On Finnish Independence Day, the 6th of December, when Finnish fortunes seemed to hit rock bottom, Colonel Paavo Talvela, an old friend of Mannerheim's, reported to the Marshal's HQ at Mikel. Mannerheim was brief and to the point. All Finnish forces in the Tolvajärvi-Ilomantsi corridor were henceforth designated Group Talvela. The colonel was to drive north and stabilize the situation, but this was easier said than done. When Talvela reached the front later that day, he found the Finns frightened, demoralized, and getting ready to retreat once again. Talvela realized that something had to be done quickly, in case the entire defense north of Ladoga collapsed. The best way of restoring their confidence, Talvala reasoned, was to give them a quick victory. Displaying a boldness that verged on the reckless, Talvala selected a few companies who seemed to be coping better than the rest, and just before midnight sent them across the ice of Lake Tolvajavi to raid Russian bivouacs. By 0200 on the 7th of December, 140 Finns, whose weapons included 16 light machine guns, lay spread out along a low ridge looking down into a Russian battalion encamped around blazing fires. Rarely have troops been presented with such clear and easy targets. The Finns opened fire. A withering barrage cut through the Russian ranks for 4 minutes, reducing the clumps of men to forlorn heaps. When they stopped, there was no movement. The entire battalion had been wiped out. Russian units to the left and right flanks began firing wildly, and then at each other. The Finns slipped back across the ice to the sounds of an ever more ferocious battle, as the Russians killed each other. News of the success of the raid reinvigorated the Finns. The following day, on the 8th of December, a force operating to the north under Colonel Per Elkholm ambushed and annihilated a Russian battalion as it attempted to find its way out of a frozen bog. With success like this, Talvala felt confident enough to order a general counterattack. For the next 2 days, the Finns kept attacking along the flanks of the strung-out Russian units. The temperature was now -25 degrees. The snowdrifts were deep and solid, and the Russians had no skis. As the Finns swept around them, the Russians tried to hit back with tactical airstrikes, which helped Soviet morale but had little chance of locating their well-camouflaged enemy. Late on the 21st of December, 2 companies of Finns crossed the ice of Lake Tolvajavi to attack the village of Olgajärvi from the north. 2 companies attacked from the south. The Russians had turned each building